The Arizona sun did not merely shine upon the territory in the late summer of 1885. It bore down with the weight of a heavy iron hand, pressing the life out of the sagebrush and turning the red dirt into a fine, choking powder. Dusty Creek was a settlement that seemed to have been coughed up by the earth itself. A cluster of raw timber buildings huddled nervously alongside the steel veins of the new railroad tracks. The town existed for two reasons: to water the iron horses that screamed across the plains, and to serve the ambition of men who sought to tame a land that had no desire to be broken. Eleanor Carver, known to everyone who had ever seen her handle a Winchester or break a Colt as Nell, stood on the weathered porch of the general store. She shielded her eyes against the glare, looking past the false fronts of the saloon and the livery stable toward the jagged spine of the red mountains in the distance. At 22 years of age, Nell was not the delicate prairie flower that the Eastern magazines liked to feature in their etchings. She was as sturdy as a willow in a windstorm, with skin dusted golden by the sun and hands that were rough from rope work. Her hair, the color of dried wheat, was pulled back severely, though a few rebellious strands always managed to escape, whipping across a face that held more determination than was considered polite for a woman. She adjusted the heavy sack of flour on her hip. Inside her pocket, her fingers brushed against the few silver dollars remaining from the sale of her father's last steer. $12. That was all they had to show for a season of sweat and back-breaking labor. Her dream of buying the plot of land near the Sweetwater Creek, the one where she could raise Appaloosas and answer to no man, felt as distant as the moon. "You look like you are plotting a murder, Nell," a voice drawled from the shadow of the overhang. Nell turned to see Dr. Finnegan wiping his spectacles with a handkerchief. He was a kind man, but he drank too much whiskey to forget the limbs he had sawed off during the war. "Just plotting a future, Doctor," Nell replied, her voice low and textured like rough velvet. "Though in this town, the two often look the same." "If you are looking for your brother," the doctor said, placing his glasses back on his nose, "he is over at the garrison. He has been following Captain Hargrove around like a stray dog looking for a bone." Nell's jaw tightened. Jacob, her older brother, had once been the steady hand on the plow, the one who taught her how to track a deer. But lately, the promise of Army silver and the glory of civilizing the frontier had twisted him. He saw the land not as something to live with, but as something to conquer. And the obstacle to that conquest was the Apache. The very word seemed to lower the temperature of the air. Even in the midday heat, Apache. Specifically, the whispers about a man named Dasan. In the saloons, the miners and railroad workers spoke of Dasan as if he were a phantom risen from the underworld. They said he was a chief of the Chiricahua band, a man who could vanish into a shadow and strike with the ferocity of a mountain lion. They said he was a monster who butchered for sport. Nell shifted the flour sack, feeling the ache in her shoulder. She knew the stories. She knew the fear that kept the women of Dusty Creek awake at night, clutching their rosaries, but she also knew something else, something she buried deep beneath her ribcage, a secret that burned hotter than the Arizona sun. She walked toward the wagon where her father, Thomas Carver, waited. He was a shell of a man now, worn down by debt and drought, his eyes always looking at the ground as if searching for the pride he had lost. "Jacob is not coming, Pa," Nell said, tossing the flour into the back of the buckboard wagon. "He is busy playing soldier," Thomas sighed, a rattling sound in his chest. "The boy wants to make something of himself. Nell, the captain promised him land warrants. If he helps clear the valley." "Clear the valley," Nell repeated, the words tasting like ash. "You mean to clear the people? They are savages." "Nell," her father muttered, reciting the lines he had heard in town. "They are holding back the future." Nell did not answer. She climbed onto the wagon seat and took the reins. Her silence was a fortress. How could she tell him? How could she tell anyone in Dusty Creek that 15 years ago, when the great sandstorm of 1870 had separated a 7-year-old girl from her family's wagon train? It was not a cavalry patrol that had found her. She remembered the howling wind that had flayed her skin. She remembered the thirst that had made her throat swell until she could not cry. And she remembered the hands. Not white hands, but brown, calloused hands that had lifted her from the dust. A woman, an Apache woman who had lost her own child to fever, had found the half-dead white girl. For 3 days, that woman had hidden Nell in a small cave, fed her mashed corn and water from a gourd, and hummed songs that sounded like the wind in the canyons. In those 3 days, before a frantic search party had stumbled near and the woman had vanished, Nell had learned more than survival. She had learned words. She remembered the sound of them. Tu, water, gao, home. She learned that the savages cried when they were sad and laughed when the sun hit the rocks just right. She felt a debt to them, a heavy, silent stone of gratitude in her gut that she could never share with a soul. A bugle call cut through the dusty air, sharp and brassy. Nell pulled on the reins, halting the horses. Down the main street, a column of dust rose. The iron gates of the army stockade swung open, and the cavalcade emerged. At the lead was Captain Caleb Hargrove. He was a man carved from ice and ambition, his blue uniform immaculate despite the dust. He sat on a tall bay gelding, his posture rigid, his saber gleaming at his hip. Hargrove did not look at the townspeople. He looked over them, his eyes fixed on a horizon he intended to own. Behind him rode the scouts, and there was Jacob. He wore a mix of buckskin and denim, a new repeater rifle slung across his back. He looked proud, but Nell saw the tightness around his eyes, the desperation to be someone of consequence. "Where are they going?" a woman on the boardwalk asked nervously. "Negotiations." A man spat, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Hargrove is going to talk peace with the chiefs, if you ask me. The only peace an Apache understands is the business end of a .45. Nell watched the procession. Behind the soldiers, there was a smaller wagon, a cage on wheels. Inside sat 2 Apache men, prisoners taken from a skirmish 3 days prior. They were being brought along as guides or perhaps bargaining chips. They looked battered, their clothes torn, but their heads were high, their eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of defiance and resignation. The wagon passed close to where Nell sat. The crowd jeered, throwing insults like stones. "Murderers! Devils!" The noise was deafening, but as the cage rattled by, the 2 prisoners spoke to one another. It was a low, rapid exchange, lost under the shouting of the townsfolk, but Nell heard it. The sounds triggered that buried memory, the vocabulary of her 3 days in the cave, unlocking the meaning. One man whispered a phrase that meant broken word. The other replied, his voice flat, speaking of a trap in the canyon. Nell's heart hammered against her ribs. Broken words. Trap. This was not a peace mission. She looked at Hargrove straight back. The captain had no intention of negotiating. He was using the meeting to lure the Apache leadership, perhaps even the elusive Dasan, into a kill box. And he was dragging her brother into the middle of it. "Nell," her father asked, sensing her tension. "What is it?" "Nothing," she lied, her voice tight. She snapped the reins, urging the horses forward, away from the soldiers, away from the lie. But her hands were shaking. They rode back to their small, struggling ranch in silence. The homestead was a collection of gray wood structures leaning against the wind, 5 miles out of town. The land here was hard, yielding little grass, but it was the only home she knew. That evening, the sun set in a bruise of purple and blood orange. Nell finished her chores mechanically. She fed the chickens, pumped water for the horses, and checked the fences. The air was thick, charged with static electricity. It was the kind of atmosphere that preceded a thunderstorm, yet there were no clouds in the sky. She found Jacob in the barn, packing his saddlebags. He had ridden ahead of the column to say goodbye to their father and gather supplies before rejoining Hargrove at dawn. "You do not have to go, Jacob," Nell said, leaning against the stall door. The smell of hay and horse sweat was comforting, a stark contrast to the cold fear in her stomach. Jacob didn't look up. He was aggressively polishing the stock of his rifle. Do not start. Nell, we need the money. Hargrove says if this goes well, if we secure the pass for the railroad, I will get the first pick of the new plots. Good bottomland, near the river. Not this dust bowl. And what if it goes wrong? Nell asked. I saw the prisoners. Jacob, I have a bad feeling. She couldn't tell him she understood their words. He would ask how. He would ask why she had kept it from him. In this time, in this place. Admitting sympathy for the Apache was akin to admitting treason. Jacob laughed. A short, harsh sound. A bad feeling. That is just a woman's worry. Hargrove has 200 men. We have a Gatling gun. The Apache have bows and rusted muskets. It will be over before noon tomorrow. They have Dasan? Nell said quietly. Jacob stopped polishing. He looked at her, and for a second, the bravado slipped, revealing the frightened boy underneath. Dasan is just a man. Nell, he bleeds like anyone else, and once he is gone, this country will finally be civilized. He slung the saddlebag over his shoulder and brushed past her. Take care of Pa. I will be back in 3 days with gold in my pocket. Nell watched him walk out into the gathering dark. She wanted to grab his arm, to scream that he was walking into a betrayal, that Hargrove was the one breaking the peace. Not the Apache, but the words died in her throat. She had no proof, just the whispers of 2 prisoners and the memory of a ghost mother. She walked back to the main house but could not bring herself to go inside. Instead, she sat on the steps of the porch. The night had fully descended. The desert was vast and indifferent, a sea of black shadows. Far to the east, the mournful wail of a train whistle drifted across the plains. It sounded like a creature in pain, lonely and mechanical. It was the sound of the future coming to crush the past. The wind picked up, rustling the dry sagebrush. It whispered through the cracks in the porch floorboards. Nell pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She felt a strange vibration in the ground, or perhaps it was in her own bones. It was the sensation of a fuse burning down. Somewhere out there, in the labyrinth of red rocks and canyons, the Apache chief was waiting. He was not the monster the drunks in the saloon described, nor was he the savage her brother wanted to kill. He was a force of nature, a man defending his dying world, and somewhere in the dark, Captain Hargrove was sharpening his saber, ready to write history in blood. Nell looked up at the stars. They were hard and bright, cold diamonds scattered on black velvet. She felt small, trapped between the unstoppable force of the railroad and the immovable object of the land's ancient guardians. 3 days, she whispered to the empty night. But the wind seemed to answer back, carrying a scent of ozone and copper, the smell of a storm, or the smell of blood. She did not know it then, as she sat shivering on the porch, but the life of Eleanor Carver, the rancher's daughter who wanted nothing more than to breed horses and be left alone, had already ended. The train whistle faded into silence, leaving only the beating of her own heart, loud and frantic in the dark. Tomorrow, the world will break open, and she would fall right through the crack. The morning sun was a white-hot coin pressed against the blue anvil of the sky, hammering the heat into the canyon floor until the very air shimmered with distortion. The convoy of 6 heavy wagons creaked and groaned like dying beasts, their iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the loose shale of the pass known as Devil's Throat. Eleanor Carver sat on the bench of the second wagon, her hands wrapped in leather guarding the reins, though her knuckles were white with a tension that had nothing to do with the horses. Beside her, Thomas Carver slumped with the resignation of a man marching to the gallows. He stared at the hindquarters of the mules, his face gray and beaded with sweat. "We should not be here, Pa," Nell said, her voice barely rising above the rattle of the harness. "This is not a supply run. It feels like a funeral procession." Thomas wiped his forehead with a ragged sleeve. "Jacob says it is safe." "Nell, Captain Hargrove gave his word. The treaty flags are flying. We deliver the grain, we collect the script, and we go home. $50. Nell, we cannot turn down $50. Nell looked ahead. Riding point was Captain Caleb Hargrove, his posture rigid, his saber reflecting the sun like a signal mirror. Flanking him were 20 troopers in dusty blue wool, carbines resting on their thighs. And there was Jacob, her brother, riding close to the captain, looking important and foolish in his new scout jacket. She looked up at the towering walls of red rock that squeezed the trail into a narrow choke point. It was a perfect place for an ambush, but her gut told her the danger was not coming from the rocks above, but from the men riding in front. She had seen the way the soldiers checked their weapons every 10 minutes. She had seen the way Hargrove scanned the ridge, not with caution, but with anticipation. They were not carrying enough grain to feed a village. The barrels in the back of her wagon were light, hollow-sounding when the wheels hit a bump. "It is a trap," Nell whispered, the realization settling in her stomach like a stone. "Pa, get the rifle." "Hush now, girl," Thomas hissed, though his hand drifted toward the Winchester beneath the seat. Suddenly, the column halted. The silence that followed was heavy, amplified by the echo of the canyon. A single hawk cried out, circling high above. From the northern ridge, a figure appeared, an Apache warrior on a paint horse, holding a white cloth tied to a lance. He sat motionless, a silhouette against the blinding sky. He was waiting for the parley. Nell watched Hargrove. The captain did not raise his hand in greeting. Instead, he slowly drew a long-barreled revolver from his holster. He did not aim at the warrior on the ridge. He turned slightly, aiming into the shadows of the scrub brush where the negotiation party was supposed to be waiting. "Fire!" Hargrove screamed, his voice cracking with bloodlust. The canyon exploded. It was not the Apache who fired first. The volley came from the soldiers, a disciplined, thundering crack of carbines that ripped into the brush. The illusion of a peace mission evaporated in a cloud of sulfur smoke. "Get down!" Nell screamed, shoving her father onto the floorboards of the wagon. The horses screamed as the noise sent them into a panic. The wagon lurched violently, slamming Nell against the wooden bench. Chaos swallowed the world. Arrows and return fire began to rain down from the rocks. But it was sporadic, confused. The Apache had been caught off guard, expecting talk, not a massacre. Jacob was shouting something, waving his hat, directing fire toward a cluster of boulders. Nell grabbed the reins, fighting to keep the team from bolting over the edge of the ravine. "They are slaughtering them!" Nell cried out, her eyes stinging from the smoke. Through the haze, she saw women and children scattering from the brush, running for the safety of the cliff face. This was not a war party they were engaging in. It was a family group coming for food. A soldier near the front wagon dismounted, kneeling to take careful aim. Nell followed his line of sight. He was not aiming at a warrior. He was tracking a teenage boy, no older than 14, who was scrambling up a scree slope, unarmed, trying to reach safety. The soldier exhaled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Nell did not think. The memory of a cave, of brown hands offering water, of a lullaby hummed in the dark, surged forward and took control of her muscles. She snatched the Colt revolver from her holster, the one Jacob had told her was too heavy for a woman, and leveled it. She squeezed the trigger. The heavy caliber slug did not hit the soldier in the chest. She was not a murderer. It smashed into the stock of his rifle in his right hand. The soldier screamed, dropping his weapon as wood splinters and blood sprayed the air. His shot went wide, kicking up dust 3 feet to the left of the fleeing boy. The Apache boy scrambled over the ridge and vanished. The soldier turned, clutching his mangled hand, his eyes wide with shock as he looked at Nell. "Traitor!" he shrieked. "She shot me! The girl shot me!" Jacob turned in his saddle, his face a mask of horror. "Nell!" Time seemed to freeze. Nell sat there, the smoking pistol in her hand, realizing she had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had fired on her own kind to save the enemy. Then, a sound cut through the din of battle, a war cry that sounded like the tearing of the earth itself. From the highest western ridge, a line of riders appeared. They did not creep, They plunged down the steep slope like an avalanche of flesh and fury. Leading them was a man on a massive black stallion. He wore no shirt, his chest broad and painted with a jagged stripe of red ochre. His black hair streamed behind him, held back by a headband of red cloth. It was Dasan, the chief. He did not look like a man. He looked like a judgment sent from the mountain spirits. "Fall back," Hargrove yelled, his arrogance shattering. "Flank left! Flank left!" But it was too late. Dasan led his warriors into the flank of the cavalry with devastating precision. They didn't stop to shoot. They rode through the formation, using war clubs and knives. The discipline of the soldiers collapsed into panic. Nell struggled to control her wagon as a soldier's horse collided with her lead mule. The impact threw the wagon sideways. The wood splintered with a sickening crunch. "Pa!" Nell screamed. Thomas Carver had tried to stand, reaching for her. When the wagon tipped, he was thrown clear, hitting the rocky ground hard. He lay still, a bundle of old clothes in the dirt. "Pa!" Nell tried to scramble down, but the wagon was dragging on its side, the terrified horses pulling it and her along the gravel. Jacob was there, forcing his horse through the melee. He reached down, grabbing their father's collar, trying to drag him toward the retreat. "Nell, jump!" Jacob screamed, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. But before she could move, a shadow fell over her. Dasan reined his stallion in sharply, the horse rearing amidst the smoke. His dark eyes, cold and sharp as obsidian, swept the scene. He saw the wounded soldier clutching his hand. He saw the soldier pointing at Nell with his good arm, screaming accusations of betrayal. And he saw Nell, bruised and defiant, holding her empty pistol, her eyes locked on the ridge where the boy had escaped. He knew, in the chaos of battle, a warrior sees everything. He had seen the white woman shoot her own protector to save one of his blood. A trooper raised his carbine to shoot Dasan. Without looking, the chief swung his war club, knocking the man from his saddle with a bone-breaking thud. Then he looked at Nell. For a heartbeat, the battle faded. There was only the heat of the burning wagons and the intensity of his gaze. It was not gratitude she saw there. It was recognition. And something darker, possession. He spurred his horse forward. Nell raised the empty pistol, intending to strike him, to fight, but he was too fast. He leaned down from his saddle with terrifying grace, his arm sweeping out like a steel bar. He grabbed her by the waist, the fabric of her dress tearing as he hauled her up. The breath was knocked out of her as she was thrown across the withers of his horse, face down in the coarse mane. "Let me go!" Nell screamed, thrashing and kicking. She beat her fists against his thigh, against the horse's neck. "You savage, let me go!" Dasan ignored her blows as if they were the brushing of leaves. He clamped one arm over her back, pinning her down with crushing strength. He turned his horse toward the confused mass of soldiers and Apaches. He raised his rifle high in the air and shouted a phrase in the Apache tongue, his voice booming over the gunfire. "And do we go." Nell froze, her breath hitched in her throat. The words vibrated through his chest and into hers. She knew those words. The grammar was rough in her memory, but the meaning was absolute. "She is the prize of the chief. She is mine." He wasn't just claiming to be a prisoner. He was declaring to his warriors that she was untouchable, and to the soldiers that she was lost to them forever. "No!" Jacob screamed from the edge of the smoke. He tried to turn his horse to charge, but two soldiers grabbed his bridle, dragging him back as the retreat bugle sounded. "Nell, Nell!" Nell lifted her head, her hair plastered to her face with sweat and dust. She saw her brother being pulled away, his face twisted in anguish. She saw her father's body lying motionless in the red dirt near the burning wreckage of their livelihood. "Jacob!" she shrieked, reaching out a hand that grasped only air. Dasan wheeled his horse around. With a kick of his heels, the stallion surged forward, leaping over a fallen crate and charging up the steep trail toward the high country. The rest of the Apache war party followed, dissolving into the terrain like smoke returning to the fire. Nell fought. She clawed at Dasan's leg. She bit his forearm until she tasted the copper of blood and the salt of sweat. She cursed him in English, calling him every name she had ever heard whispered in the dark corners of the saloon. "Damn you," she sobbed, her tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. "Damn you to hell." Dasan did not flinch. He did not strike her. He simply adjusted his grip, his arm a band of iron that kept her from falling to her death as the horse scrambled up the treacherous rocks. He rode with the ease of a man who was part centaur, his body moving in perfect rhythm with the beast beneath him. As they crested the ridge, the sounds of the battle faded, replaced by the wind howling through the canyons. Dasan slowed the horse for a moment, looking back. Nell pushed herself up, gasping for air, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked down into the canyon. The supply wagons were burning, sending thick pillars of black smoke into the pristine sky. The bodies of men and horses were scattered like discarded toys. The life she had known, the poverty, the struggle, the dream of the horse ranch. Her father's quiet sadness was all down there. Turning to ash, she looked at the man who held her. Up close, the red paint on his face was cracked, his skin the color of polished mahogany. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, hard and unreadable. He did not look at her with lust, nor with hatred. He looked at her as a man looked at a weapon he had just seized from the enemy, something dangerous, something valuable, something he intended to keep. He said nothing. He simply turned the horse's head toward the deep, jagged heart of the mountains. Nell slumped against the horse's neck, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold, numbing dread. She was no longer Eleanor Carver of Dusty Creek. She was the woman who had shot a soldier. She was a traitor. And now, she was the property of the Apache chief. The mountains swallowed them whole, and the world of white men fell away, leaving only the silence of the high desert and the rhythmic thud of hooves carrying her into the unknown. The transition from the blinding white heat of the desert to the cool, verdant embrace of the hidden valley was so abrupt that Eleanor Carver felt as though she had ridden through a curtain separating two different worlds. They had traveled for hours, climbing higher into the Dragoon Mountains, navigating trails that were little more than scratches on the granite face of the earth. When the Apache war party finally slowed, the sun was dipping below the peaks, casting long, violet shadows across the land. They entered a canyon that opened up like a secret palm held open to the sky. Here, the air did not smell of dust and death. It smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and roasting meat. Nell expected a fortress of spikes and skulls, a den of the monsters described in the dime novels Jacob used to read. What she saw froze the breath in her throat. Spread out along the banks of a glittering creek were dozens of wickiups, dome-shaped dwellings covered in brush and hide. Children, brown and naked as nuts, ran through the tall grass, their laughter ringing like silver bells, a sound so innocent it felt like a physical blow to her expectations. Women sat in circles, grinding corn or tanning hides, their movements rhythmic and peaceful. This was not a war camp. It was a home. Dasan reined in his stallion in the center of the encampment. The return of the warriors sent a ripple through the village. The women stood up, their dark eyes scanning the riders, counting the living, searching for the dead. Dasan slid from the horse's back, his movement fluid despite the exhaustion of the raid. He reached up and hauled Nell down, her legs, numb from hours of being draped over the animal, buckled beneath her. She hit the ground hard, the dust puffing around her skirts. She scrambled to stand, her chin lifted, defying the gravity of her situation. She was surrounded, faces, dozens of them, closed in. Some were curious, others hostile, but all of them looked at her as if she were a strange, pale creature dragged up from the bottom of a dry well. Dasan gripped her upper arm. His fingers were like steel bands, not painful, but unyielding. He spoke to the crowd, his voice deep and carrying the weight of authority. "She is mine," he said in Apache. Nell understood the words, the vocabulary of her childhood, buried under 15 years of farm life and Bible verses, stirred in the dark recesses of her mind. She is mine. It was a claim of ownership, but also, she realized with a jolt, a claim of responsibility. He pulled a length of rawhide from his belt, He did not ask for her hands, he simply took them, binding her wrists in front of her. The knots were complex, impossible to slip. Yet he left enough slack so the circulation in her fingers remained. "You stay," he said in English. The words were thick, heavily accented, as if he had to mold his mouth around the foreign shapes. He turned to a woman standing near the largest wickiup. She was tall, with streaks of gray in her heavy black braids, and a face that looked as though it had been chiseled from the canyon walls. This was Nahyani, his sister. Dasan spoke to her rapidly. Nell caught fragments. "Watch her. Do not let her run. Water." Nahyani looked at Nell with eyes that held no warmth, only a cold, measuring calculation. She nodded once to her brother, then gestured sharply for Nell to sit near the fire pit. For the first hour, Nell sat rigid, her back against a log, watching the camp transform into the evening. She saw the warriors being greeted by wives, the sharing of food. She saw the humanity of them, and it made her stomach turn with a mixture of nausea and guilt. How could these be the same men who had slaughtered the convoy? How could they laugh while her father lay dead in the canyon pa? The image of Thomas Carver lying in the dirt, a crumpled heap of old clothes, seared her mind. And Jacob, was he dead or had he run? Leaving her behind, the grief was a hot coal in her chest, fueling a sudden, reckless desperation. She had to get out. She had to get back to the world that made sense. The women were busy distributing the meat from a fresh kill. Nahyani had her back turned, scolding a dog that had come too close to the cooking pot. Nell saw her chance. She did not think about the miles of wilderness, the bears, or the lack of water. She simply reacted. She scrambled to her feet and bolted toward the tree line at the eastern edge of the camp. "Hey!" a woman shouted. Nell ran. Her boots slipped on the pine needles. Her bound hands threw off her balance, making her clumsy. She tore through a thicket of manzanita, the branches whipping her face, leaving stinging scratches on her cheeks. Her breath came in ragged gasps. "Run! Just run!" She reached the cover of the taller pines, the shadows deepening. Hope, wild and foolish, flared in her chest. Then, the earth seemed to shift. A figure dropped from a rock outcropping directly in her path. It was Dasan. He had not run. He had moved through the forest with the silence of a shadow. Nell skidded to a halt, turning to run the other way, but he was already there. He reached out and grabbed the tether binding her wrists. He jerked it, not violently, but with enough force to spin her around. She lashed out, kicking at his shins, screaming in English. "Let me go, you murderer, let me go." Dasan did not shout back. He did not strike her. He simply stepped inside her guard, dipped his shoulder, and in one smooth motion, hefted her up. He carried her over his shoulder like a sack of grain. "Put me down!" Nell shrieked, hammering her bound fists against his broad back. It was like hitting a wall of solid oak. He ignored her. He walked back into the camp, past the staring eyes of the tribe. The humiliation was absolute. Nell hung there, face burning, her struggles becoming weaker as the reality of his strength overwhelmed her. He was not just stronger than her. He was inevitable. He walked to the center of the camp and dropped her none too gently onto a pile of buffalo robes near his fire. He stood over her, his chest heaving slightly, the only sign of his exertion. His eyes were dark pools reflecting the dying light. "Run again," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I tie your feet." He turned and walked away, leaving her gasping in the dust, stripped of her dignity but physically unharmed. It was a lesson, she realized. He would not break her bones, but he would not tolerate her defiance. Night fell, bringing a chill that seeped into the marrow. Nell curled into a ball on the robes, shivering. Her stomach was cramped with hunger, but she refused to ask for anything. A shadow fell across the entrance of the space where she lay. Nell flinched, expecting Dasan. Instead, a slender figure stepped into the firelight. It was a boy, perhaps 14 years of age. He held a wooden bowl in his hands. Nell sat up slowly. She recognized him. It was the boy from the canyon, the one she had shot the soldier to save. He stood there, looking at her with wide, dark eyes. His face was unpainted, youthful, yet marked by the seriousness of the life he lived. He was called Kiona. He knelt and placed the bowl on the ground in front of her. It contained a stew of rabbit and wild onions, smelling rich and savory. Beside it, he placed a gourd of water. He did not speak. He pointed to the food, then to his own chest, and then to her. The gesture was clear. "I am here because you are here." Nell looked at the boy. This was the enemy. This was the reason she was a prisoner. If she had let the soldiers shoot him, she might be safe in her wagon right now. But looking at his face, seeing the fear and the gratitude warring in his expression, she could not find the hatred she wanted to feel. "Thank you," she whispered, the English words feeling heavy on her tongue. Kiona nodded once, then vanished back into the dark. The next morning began before dawn. A moccasined foot nudged Nell awake. It was Nahiani. The older woman did not speak English, or if she did, she refused to use it. She chattered a string of commands, gesturing sharply at 2 heavy water skins made of animal bladder. Work. Water. Creek. Nell stood, her body aching from the hard ground and the previous day's ride. Her hands were still bound, but Nahiani untied them, only to retie a long leather lead to Nell's left wrist, holding the other end herself. "I am not a dog," Nell snapped. Nahiani yanked the leash. "Gah!" she grunted, pointing to the creek. For the next 3 days, this became Nell's life. She was a slave to the rhythm of the camp. She fetched water until her shoulders screamed. She gathered wood until her fingers were raw and filled with splinters. She scraped hides until the smell of curing flesh seemed permanently etched into her nostrils. But as she worked, she watched. She saw how the mothers strapped their babies into cradleboards, cooing to them with a tenderness that rivaled any white mother in Dusty Creek. She saw the old men sitting in the sun, telling stories that made the young warriors laugh. She saw a society that was structured, disciplined, and deeply connected. It was confusing. It was terrifying. Because if they were human, then what was she, a traitor, or just a woman caught between 2 lies? On the 4th evening, while Nell was grinding corn near the main fire, a group of men gathered nearby. Dasan was there, sitting cross-legged, sharpening a knife. Opposite him was Tahoe. Tahoe was a warrior with a face that seemed perpetually twisted in a sneer. He had been watching Nell for days, his gaze lingering on her body in a way that made her skin crawl. They were speaking in low tones, but the wind carried their voices. "The soldiers will come," Tahoe said, his voice sharp. "They will track the wagons. We should move." "We are safe here for now," another elder replied. "The pass is blocked. The white woman." Tahoe spat the words. "She is bad medicine. She brings the blue coats. We should trade her, or kill her and leave her body for them to find. Send a message." Nell froze. Her hand stopped moving on the grinding stone. "Kill her." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stared down at the yellow cornmeal, trying to keep her breathing even, but her heart hammered against her ribs. Dasan looked up from his knife. He did not look at Tahoe. He looked directly at Nell. He saw the way her shoulders had stiffened. He saw the way her hand had paused. He stood up and walked over to her. The conversation died. The other men watched. Dasan crouched down in front of her. "You are afraid," he said in English. Nell looked up, trying to mask her panic. "I am a prisoner. Of course I am afraid." Dasan switched to Apache, his eyes locking onto hers. "Did you hear him? Did you understand the wolf who wants your blood?" It was a test, a trap. Nell blinked. The instinct to lie was strong, but the shock was stronger. She started in English, then stopped. She had reacted. She had given herself away. A flicker of surprise crossed Dasan's face. It was the first time she had seen him look anything other than stoic. "You speak," he said, switching back to English, his voice dropping to a whisper. "How? Nell swallowed hard. "A little. From a long time ago. A woman. She saved me." Dasan studied her face, searching for the lie, but finding only the terrified truth. He slowly reached out and touched a loose strand of hair near her cheek. It was not a caress. It was a verification that she was real. A white woman with an Apache tongue, he mused. You are full of secrets. Izzy Nathan. Before Nell could ask what the word meant, a shadow fell over them. Tahoe stood there. He was big, broad-shouldered, and smelling of stale sweat and aggression. He looked at Dasan, then down at Nell. She is useless, Tahoe growled in Apache, stepping closer. Give her to me. I will break her. Then we can sell her to the Comancheros. He reached down, his rough hand grabbing Nell's chin, forcing her to look at him. His fingers dug into her jaw, painful and possessive. Nell gasped, trying to pull away, but he was too strong. Flash. It happened so fast Nell barely registered the movement. 1 second Tahoe was holding her, the next. Dasan was standing between them. His knife pressed against Tahoe's throat. The blade gleamed orange in the firelight, the tip indenting the skin just above Tahoe's Adam's apple. The camp went silent. Even the dogs stopped barking. Dasan did not shout. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder, vibrating with a lethal promise. Touch her again, Dasan said in Apache, clear and cold. And your hand will feed the coyotes. Tahoe froze. His eyes bulged slightly as he felt the bite of the steel. He looked at his chief, and he saw death waiting there. Slowly, Tahoe raised his hands. He stepped back, the sneer remaining, but the aggression checked. He muttered a curse, turned on his heel, and stalked away into the darkness. Dasan stood there for a moment, watching him go. Then he turned back to Nell. He sheathed his knife. He did not offer comfort. He did not ask if she was hurt. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable again. You belong to me, he said, reiterating the law he had laid down. My life is your life. My death is your death. Do not forget. He walked back to his place at the fire, leaving Nell trembling. But as the adrenaline faded, something else took its place. He had defended her, not as a piece of property to be hoarded, but with a ferocity that felt personal. He had drawn steel against his own blood for her. That night, Nell could not sleep. She lay on the buffalo robes, listening to the rhythm of the camp settling down. Somewhere, a drum was beating a slow, steady pulse like the heartbeat of the earth itself. She looked up at the smoke hole in the top of the wickiup, seeing a single star shining through. She thought of Jacob, who had called these people animals. She thought of Tahoe, who proved that some of them could be. But she also thought of Kiona's quiet gratitude, of the mother singing to her child, and of Dasan, standing between her and the dark, his knife a line of silver fire. The hatred she had held onto so tightly, the black and white certainty of who was good and who was evil, was beginning to blur. It was dissolving like sugar in hot water. She brought her hand up to her cheek, touching the spot where Dasan's fingers had brushed her hair. It felt hot. I should hate you, she whispered to the darkness. I should hate you for what you did. But as the drumbeat went on, slow and hypnotic, Nell Carver realized with a terrified sinking feeling that the hate was gone, replaced by a confusion that was far more dangerous. She was a prisoner in a valley of enemies, but for the first time since the canyon, she did not feel alone. The wind sighed through the pines outside, whispering secrets in a language she was just beginning to remember. And under the watchful eye of the Apache chief, under the vast, indifferent stars, the roots of something new began to twist and turn in the soil of her heart. The drum beat on. Thump, 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 thump. It sounded like a warning. Or perhaps it sounded like an invitation. The days in the hidden valley did not pass by the ticking of a clock, but by the movement of the sun across the granite peaks. For Eleanor Carver, time became a physical weight, measured in the ache of her muscles and the stinging blisters on her palms. At first, her labor was a performance of defiance. When Nahiani pointed to the water skins, Nell dragged them through the dust, spilling half the contents, muttering curses that would have made a mule skinner blush. But the high desert had no patience for theatrics. Thirst was a cruel master, and the cold nights demanded fire. Slowly, the rhythm of survival took over. Nell learned that green wood smoked and stung the eyes, while deadfall from the ironwood tree burned hot and clean. She learned to pound mesquite beans into flour until her arms felt like lead. She learned that the horses, the lifeline of the tribe, needed to be watered before any human touched a drop. It was a brutal education, but it was also a distraction. If she was exhausted, she could not think about the image of her father lying in the canyon. If she was focused on keeping the fire alive, she did not have to dwell on the terrifying silence of her own future. As she worked, she watched Dasan. He was not the demon the whiskey-soaked miners in Dusty Creek described. He was a man carrying the weight of a crumbling world on his shoulders. She saw him sit for hours with the elders, listening to their raspy whispers with profound patience. She saw him intervene in disputes over food, dividing the meager rations with a fairness that left his own bowl the emptiest. One evening, she saw him sitting near the creek with a group of children. He was whittling a piece of cottonwood. When he finished, he held up a small, perfectly carved coyote. A little girl, no older than 5, squealed and snatched it from his hand. For a fleeting second, the mask of the war chief slipped, and a smile, genuine and weary, touched his lips. It unnerved Nell. It was easier to hate a monster. It was dangerous to respect a man, but respect was not shared by everyone. Tahoe, the warrior Dasan had humiliated, watched the camp with eyes like burning coals. He did not approach Nell again. Dasan's threat hung heavy in the air, but his resentment festered. He gathered young men by the fire, gesturing toward Nell, then toward the shrinking supplies. "She eats our food," Nell heard him mutter one afternoon as she passed by with an armful of kindling. "She brings the blue coats closer with every breath. The chief is blinded by a white ghost." The tension in the camp was a tightly coiled snake, ready to strike. It broke on a Tuesday afternoon, under the blaze of the midday sun. The men were breaking a string of wild mustangs they had driven into the valley 2 days prior. The corral was a chaotic swirl of dust and hooves. A particularly large roan stallion was fighting the rope, rearing and plunging, his eyes rolling white with panic. Nell was scraping a deer hide nearby, her arms deep in the foul-smelling mixture of brains and ash used for curing. Suddenly, a child's cry cut through the noise of the horses. A toddler, having escaped her mother's distracted gaze, had wandered through the rails of the corral. She stood frozen in the dirt, clutching a rag doll, staring up at the terrifying mass of the roan stallion. The horse, blind with fear, spun around, his heavy hindquarters bunching to kick. The warriors on the fence shouted, but they were too far away. The mother screamed, dropping her basket. Nell did not think. The instinct that lived in her bones, the same instinct that made her a rancher's daughter before she was a captive, took over. She dropped the hide and vaulted over the fence rail. She did not run at the horse. She ran at the child. As the stallion lashed out, his hooves slicing the air where the girl's head had been a second before. Nell threw her body over the child, tucking into a tight ball in the dust. A hoof grazed Nell's shoulder, a blow that felt like a hammer strike, numbing her entire arm. Dust choked her. The horse bucked away, distracted by the ropes of the men rushing in. Nell lay in the dirt, gasping, shielding the crying toddler with her own body. Silence fell over the corral. Nell sat up, wincing as sensation returned to her shoulder in a wave of hot pain. She checked the child. The little girl was terrified but unharmed. The mother scrambled over the fence, snatching her daughter from Nell's arms. She looked at the child, checking every inch of skin, weeping with relief. Then she looked at Nell. There was no hatred in her eyes now. There was shock, and there was shame. Dasan was there. He had vaulted the fence a second after Nell. He stood over her, his chest heaving, his face pale beneath the dark pigment of his skin. He reached down and pulled Nell to her feet. "You are hurt," he said. It was not a question. "I am fine." Nell lied, clutching her throbbing shoulder. Dasan ignored her protest. He probed the spot gently with his fingers. "No bone broken, but it will be black and blue like the storm sky." He looked around the corral. Every eye was on them. Tahoe stood by the gate, his face unreadable. But for once he did not sneer. That night, the atmosphere in the camp shifted. When Nell went to the creek to wash the stench of the hide from her arms, Nayani was there. The older woman did not scowl. She handed Nell a piece of dried honeycomb, a rare treat. "Eat sachu," Nayani said, pointing to the bruise forming on Nell's shoulder. Then she pointed to the fire. "Eat." It was a small crack in the wall of hostility, but it was enough. Over the next 3 days, the women began to speak to her. They did not use English. They pointed to objects and spoke the Apache names, waiting for her to repeat them. Tu, water; Kawa, house; Sika, friend. Nell learned. She absorbed the language as the dry earth absorbed the rain, and with every word, the barrier between us and them crumbled a little more. A week later, the hunters returned with 3 elk. It was a massive haul, enough to feed the tribe for weeks. The relief was palpable. That night, the drums did not beat with the slow rhythm of vigilance, but with the fast, driving pulse of celebration. A massive bonfire was built in the center of the clearing. The flames leapt 20 feet into the air, sending sparks dancing up to meet the stars. The smell of roasting meat was thick and intoxicating. Nell sat on the periphery, watching. She felt a strange ache in her chest, a longing to belong, warring with the knowledge that she did not. Suddenly, 2 young women grabbed her hands. They were laughing, their faces flushed with the heat of the fire. They pulled her toward the circle of dancers. "No, I cannot," Nell protested, digging her heels in. But the rhythm was infectious. The drums were loud, vibrating in the ground, in her teeth, in her blood. The women did not let go. They dragged her into the ring. Nell stumbled at first, her boots heavy and clumsy compared to the soft moccasins of the Apache women. But the beat was simple, primal. Thump, 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 thump. She found herself moving, her body swaying, her feet finding the cadence. She looked across the fire. Dasan was standing on the other side, just outside the circle of light. He was not dancing. He was watching her. The firelight distorted the air between them, but his gaze was clear. It was intense, unwavering. He looked at her not as a captive, not even as a woman he had claimed, but as something miraculous that had survived the fire. Nell felt a flush rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat of the bonfire. Her heart hammered against her ribs, matching the frantic pace of the drums. She felt alive. For the first time since the ambush, she felt vividly, dangerously alive. But the intensity was too much. The noise, the heat, the look in his eyes, it was overwhelming. Nell broke from the circle. She pushed past the dancers, gasping for air, and ran toward the edge of the camp. She needed silence. She needed the dark. She climbed the narrow trail that led to the limestone overlook above the valley. It was a steep climb, but she scrambled up the rocks until she reached the flat shelf of stone that jutted out over the void. Here, the air was cool and thin. The sounds of the celebration below were reduced to a distant hum. Nell stood on the edge, looking up. The sky was a vast dome of obsidian, shattered by millions of stars. The Milky Way was a river of crushed diamonds stretching from one horizon to the other. It was beautiful, and it was indifferent. It did not care about wars or railroads or broken families. "Pa," she whispered, the name catching in her throat. "Jacob." She tried to summon their faces, but they felt distant, like photographs fading in the sun. "You should not be here alone," the voice came from behind her. Nell spun around. Dasan emerged from the shadows of the pines. He had followed her. He moved with a predator's grace, silent and sure. "I needed to breathe," Nell said, her voice trembling slightly. "It is too loud down there." Dasan stepped onto the rock shelf. He stood 10 feet away, giving her space. Yet his presence filled the emptiness. "You dance well," he said, "for a white woman." "I dance like a clumsy foal," Nell retorted, hugging her arms around herself against the chill. "Why do you watch me? Dasan, why don't you let me go?" Dasan looked out at the valley, at the fires burning below. "If I let you go, you die. The desert kills. The bears kill." or the soldiers kill you for being with us. That is not why, Nell challenged him, emboldened by the darkness. You kept me alive in the canyon. You fought Tahoe for me. Why? She stepped closer to him. I killed a soldier. I shot my own kind. I am a traitor to them, and to your people. I am a burden. So why am I still breathing? Dasan turned to face her. The starlight caught the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the depth of his eyes. Because you saw Kiona, he said, his English broken but the meaning piercing. In the canyon, the gun was in your hand. You could kill the boy. You shot the soldier. He took a step toward her. And because you speak the words. Tu, Gao. You speak the spirit tongue. He reached up and touched his own chest, over his heart. My head says you are the enemy. My head says trade you for rifles. He paused, his jaw tightening. But my heart, it does not listen to the war drums. Nell's breath hitched. The wind whistled softly through the rocks, a lonely, haunting sound. You are the chief, she whispered. You cannot have a heart that betrays you. I am a man, Dasan said. The admission hung in the air, heavy and vulnerable. He closed the distance between them. He was close enough now that she could smell the wood smoke on his skin and the faint, masculine scent of sage. When I took you, he said, his voice dropping to a rough murmur. I said you are mine. To the tribe, it means I own you. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, trembling slightly. But to me, it means I stand between you and the arrow. It means I stand between you and the cold. His eyes burned into hers. You are mine to protect. Eleanor, not to break. Eleanor, he had used her name, not white woman, not captive. The claim was fierce. It was absolute. It was a declaration of war against the entire world for the sake of one life. Nell felt the walls she had built around her heart crumbling. She looked at this man, this savage, who had shown her more honor than the captain in his polished boots. She looked at the scar that jagged across his chest, a souvenir from a cavalry saber. Without thinking, she reached out. Her fingers brushed the raised skin of the scar. Dasan flinched, his muscles contracting under her touch, but he did not pull away. He looked down at her hand, then up at her eyes. Where did you get this? She asked softly. San Carlos? He rasped. Long ago, a broken treaty. I am sorry, she whispered. Do not be sorry, he said. Be here. The air between them crackled with a tension that was terrifying and inevitable. It was the tension of a storm about to break. Dasan leaned down. His movements were slow, giving her every second to run, every second to push him away. Nell did not run. She stood rooted to the stone, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. His lips brushed hers. It was tentative at first, a question asked in the dark. His mouth was warm, tasting of life. Nell gasped, a small sound of surrender. Then the dam broke. Dasan groaned low in his throat and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against the hard plane of his body. The kiss deepened, becoming fierce, hungry. It was not the kiss of a conqueror. It was the kiss of a drowning man finding air. Nell's hands tangled in his long hair. She kissed him back with a desperation that matched his own. At that moment, there was no war. There was no army, no reservation, no dusty creek. There was only the heat of his skin, the strength of his arms, and the vast, witnessing canopy of the stars, under the heavens, amidst the scent of pine and impending danger. The seed that had been planted in the canyon finally cracked open. Love did not just bloom. It took root, driving deep into the bedrock of their souls, binding them together with a force stronger than blood. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other, two outcasts finding a home in the other's arms. Then, slowly, Dasan pulled back. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. His hands were still on her waist, holding her as if he feared she might vanish if he let go. The reality of what they had done came crashing down like a rock slide. Nell stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth. Her lips felt swollen, sensitive. She looked at him. and the guilt washed over her cold and sharp. She had just kissed the enemy. She had just betrayed the memory of her father. She had betrayed every lesson she had ever been taught about who she was. She stammered. I cannot. Dasan straightened up. The vulnerability vanished from his face, replaced by a masked stoicism, but his eyes were still blazing. Go, he said, his voice rough. Go to your tent. Sleep. He turned away from her, looking back out over the valley, placing his hands on the cold stone of the overlook as if to steady himself. Nell fled. She ran down the trail, stumbling in the dark, tears blurring her vision. She crawled onto her buffalo robes in the wickiup, pulling the furs over her head. She lay there, shivering violently. She felt ashamed. She felt terror. But beneath it all, she felt a lingering warmth where he had touched her, a fire that refused to be extinguished. She closed her eyes, but she could not sleep. Every time she drifted off, she saw his face. She felt the rough texture of his skin. Outside, the fire died down to embers. For the next 3 days, Dasan did not speak to her. He did not look at her. He rode out at dawn with the scouts and returned after dark. He was a ghost in his own camp, but Nell felt him. Every time she walked across the clearing, she felt the weight of his awareness. He was keeping his distance, perhaps afraid that he'd crossed a line from which there was no return. But it was too late. The line was gone. The roots had taken hold, and they were drinking deep. The scouts returned on a wind that smelled of sulfur and wet iron. They did not ride into the camp with the whoops of victorious hunters. They slid from their exhausted ponies with the grim silence of men who had seen the face of a storm. Eleanor Carver stood near the drying racks, her hands still coated in cornflour, watching the commotion. The camp, usually a place of rhythmic order, fractured into chaos. Mothers gathered their children. The elders moved with stiff urgency toward the central fire. Dasan emerged from his wickiup. He looked at the lead scout, a weathered warrior named Goya. Speak, Dasan commanded. Goya's voice was hoarse, carrying across the clearing. The blue coats are coming, not a patrol, an army. He gestured toward the valley entrance. They bring the thunder wagons, cannons. Nell felt the blood drain from her face. Mountain howitzers. Captain Hargrove was not coming to negotiate. He was coming to erase them. Dasan looked toward the eastern ridge. How many? 300, Goya replied. And they ride the iron road. The train stopped at the pass. They are unloading horses and guns. The camp erupted in a low murmur of fear. 300 soldiers, cannons. It was an extermination force. Nell took a step forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew why. She knew the justification Hargrove would use to requisition that kind of firepower from the territorial governor. Apache savages kidnap white woman. Innocent rancher's daughter held hostage. She was not a person to Caleb Hargrove. She was a headline. She was the match he needed to burn the entire territory to the ground so the railroad could claim the ashes. Dasan turned, his eyes finding Nell across the crowd. The look on his face was not one of accusation, but of a terrible realization. He knew it too. Tahoe stepped into the center of the circle. The warrior's face was twisted with fear that masked itself as rage. He pointed a shaking finger at Nell. She brings this, Tahoe shouted, his voice cracking. The white witch calls her people. I told you she is bad medicine. A murmur of agreement rippled through the warriors. Fear was a dry tinder, and Tahoe had just struck a spark. Hand her over, Tahoe screamed, drawing his knife. Give her the blue coats. Maybe they will turn back if they have their prize. Yes, another warrior shouted. Give her back. Why should we bleed for a white ghost? The mood of the camp shifted violently. Women who had shared food with Nell days ago now pulled their children behind their skirts, looking at her with wide, terrified eyes. The line between guest and enemy, carefully built over weeks, evaporated in seconds. Nell felt the walls closing in. She looked at Dasan. He stood like a stone in a rushing river, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, but he was outnumbered by the panic of his own people. She made a decision. She pushed through the crowd. Hands reached out to grab her, to shove her. but she moved with a desperation that made her untouchable. She stopped in the center of the circle, putting herself between Dasan and Tahoe. "Dasan," she said, her voice trembling but loud enough to be heard. "Let me go to them." Dasan looked down at her, his jaw tight. "No, I can stop this," Nell pleaded, grabbing his forearm. "I will ride out. I will wave a white flag. I will tell Hargrove I escaped. I will tell him you treated me well. If he has me, he has no reason to attack." Dasan shook his head slowly. "You think like a rancher. Eleanor, you do not think like a soldier. Hargrove does not want you. He wants the land. He wants the glory." He leaned closer, his voice a rough whisper. "If you walk out there, he will shoot you before you speak a word, and then he will tell the world the Apache killed you. Your dead body is worth more to him than your living breath." "We cannot just wait to die," Tahoe roared, stepping closer, emboldened by the crowd's support. "Tie her up, drag her to the pass, throw her to them." He reached for Nell. Nell slapped his hand away. The sound rang out like a pistol shot. Then she drew a breath that seared her lungs and turned to face the tribe. She did not look at Dasan. She looked at the women, the elders, the warriors who wanted to sacrifice her. And she spoke. "Shikashi." The word ripped through the air. "Listen to me, it was Apache. Broken, accented, heavy with the flat vowels of her English tongue. But it was Apache." The camp froze. Tahoe stepped back as if he had been slapped. Dasan's eyes widened, a flicker of shock breaking his stoic mask. Nell continued, her voice gaining strength, pulling the words from the deep well of her childhood memory. "Giving me to the white soldiers will not save you," she said, struggling with the grammar, using her hands to emphasize the meaning. "They do not want me. They want the water. They want the valley. They want the stones under your feet." She pointed toward the canyon entrance. "If I die, they come. If I live, they come. The wolf does not stop hunting because you give him a bone. The wolf is hungry for the whole deer." Silence descended on the clearing. Absolute, stunned silence. For weeks, they had spoken around her, assuming she was deaf to their world. Now, she stood before them, speaking the tongue of the people, claiming a voice in their council. It was a violation of order, but it was also a revelation. She was not a stranger. She was a spirit who had been listening. Tahoe stared at her, his mouth opening and closing. The hatred in his eyes faltered, replaced by confusion. A witch, or something else. Dasan stepped to her side. He did not speak to the crowd. He looked at Nell, and in his eyes, there was a fierce, burning pride that terrified her more than Tahoe's knife. He had known she understood, but he had not known she possessed the courage to claim it. "She speaks the truth," Dasan said, his voice low and dangerous. "Hargrove comes for blood. We will not give him ours for free." He looked at Nell. "You know the blue coats. You know this captain. How does he fight?" This was the precipice. To answer was to betray her race, her history, and the memory of her brother Jacob, who might be riding with that very column. But to remain silent was to sentence Kiona, Nahiani, and Dasan to death. Nell looked at the faces around her. These people had fed her. They had protected her. "He is arrogant," Nell said in English, switching back because the complex thoughts were too hard in Apache. Dasan translated as she spoke. "He thinks you are savages who will run at the first sound of the big guns. He will use the old wagon road because he has the cannons. He will try to flush you into the box canyon." She knelt in the dust, drawing a map with her finger. "He will set the guns here, on the ridge. He will rain fire down on the village to make you panic. Then, he will send the cavalry to close the neck of the bottle." She looked up at Dasan. "But he does not know the scree slope on the north face is stable. He thinks it is a wall. If you put men there, above the guns." Dasan looked at the map. He saw the strategy. It was a trap turned inside out. He looked at her. "If you lie to us, Eleanor, we all die." "I am not lying," she whispered. "I am choosing." Dasan nodded once. He turned to his warriors. "We move, now. Women and children to the caves. Warriors, we hunt." The next 2 hours were a blur of controlled panic. The village was dismantled. The non-combatants vanished into the high caves that riddled the limestone cliffs. Nell was ordered to go with them, to be guarded by Nahyani. "No," Nell argued as Dasan checked the load in his Winchester. "I cannot sit in a cave. I know the bugle calls. I can tell you what they mean." "You stay," Dasan commanded, gripping her shoulders. "This is not your fight to bleed in. It became my fight when you put me on your horse," she retorted. He pulled her close, kissing her hard on the forehead, a gesture so desperate and tender it felt like a goodbye. "Stay alive, Izzy Nathan. Stay alive." He turned and vanished into the rocks. Nahyani grabbed Nell's arm and dragged her toward the caves. But Nell's mind was racing. She knew Hargrove. He was arrogant, yes, but he was also a graduate of West Point. He wouldn't just rely on a frontal assault. He would have a contingency. As she sat in the mouth of the cave, watching the empty village below, the first cannon shot shattered the afternoon. Boom! The sound was physical. A punch to the chest. A shell whistled through the air and exploded near the creek, sending a geyser of water and mud into the air. Then came the bugles. Below, the battle unfolded exactly as Nell had predicted. The cavalry advanced up the main road. The Apache, positioned high on the unclimbable north slope, rained fire down on the artillery positions. The element of surprise was total. The soldiers, expecting a fleeing rabble, found themselves pinned down by precision fire. But something was wrong. From her vantage point, high in the cliffs, Nell looked to the south. A plume of dust was rising from a narrow deer trail that bypassed the main valley floor. A flanking column. Hargrove had split his force, while Dasan and the main body of warriors were focused on the cannons in the north. 50 troopers were circling behind to cut off the retreat to the caves. They would slaughter the women and children. Nell looked at Nahyani. She pointed to the dust. "Soldiers there!" Nahyani looked, her eyes widening in horror. The warriors were too far away to see it. They were deafened by the cannon fire. "Someone has to warn him," Nell shouted. Nahyani grabbed a rifle, but she was old. Her legs were bad. She would never make it across the screen in time. Nell grabbed the bridle of a pony that had been tethered near the cave entrance. It was a small, skittish mare. "No," Nahyani cried. "I have to," Nell said. She didn't wait for permission. She swung onto the bare back of the pony and kicked its flanks. The mare scrambled down the rocky path. Nell leaned forward, urging the animal into a gallop. She had to ride across the open valley floor, between the two lines of fire, to reach the ridge where Dasan was fighting. She burst out of the tree line. The noise was deafening. Bullets buzzed like angry hornets. She saw the main battle line. Dasan was there, firing his rifle, directing his men. He did not see the threat coming from behind. Nell screamed, but her voice was lost in the roar of the howitzers. She rode harder, her hair flying behind her like a banner. She reached the center of the valley. She stood up in her stirrups, or would have, had she had them gripping the mane. "Dasan, behind you south to the south." Her voice, shrill with terror, cut through a lull in the firing. Dasan turned. He saw her. He saw the white woman on the pony, in the middle of the kill zone, pointing frantically toward the southern ridge. He looked. He saw the glint of sabers in the dust, the flanking column. He shouted a command. Half his warriors spun around, sprinting to intercept the new threat before it could reach the caves. She had saved them, but she had also revealed herself on the valley floor. Captain Hargrove lowered his binoculars. He sat on his horse near the artillery position, safe behind a wall of rock. He saw the rider. He saw the blonde hair. "It's the girl," a lieutenant shouted. "It's Miss Carver. She's escaping." Hargrove's face twisted into a mask of cold fury. She wasn't escaping. She was signaling. She was commanding. The narrative he had built the helpless victim was shattering right in front of his men. If she lived, if she testified, his career was over. The railroad money was gone. "She is compromised," Hargrove shouted, his voice carrying over the din. She is fighting with them. She is a hostile combatant. Sir, that is a civilian, the lieutenant protested. I said she is hostile, Hargrove roared, drawing his revolver. Cut her down. Fire, that is an order. The soldiers hesitated. They looked at the girl, but the Gatling gunner, a man trained to obey machines and orders, swiveled his barrel. Nell saw the multi-barreled gun turn toward her. She saw the muzzle flash. She kicked the pony, trying to reach the cover of the rocks. The ground around her erupted in small geysers of dirt. The pony screamed, hit in the flank, and went down. Nell was thrown clear, rolling in the dirt. She scrambled to her feet, coughing, dazed. She was out in the open, 50 yards from the tree line. Kill her! Hargrove screamed, firing his own pistol. Tahoe, positioned on a low rock near the valley floor, saw it all. He saw the white captain firing at the white girl. He saw the girl who had spoken his language trying to save his wife and children in the caves. The hate in his heart faltered, blocked by the undeniable reality of her courage. He raised his rifle, not at Nell, but at the Gatling gunner. But he was too slow. The gunner adjusted his aim. The barrel spun. Nell squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the impact. A shadow hit her. It was not a bullet. It was a body, hard, heavy, and smelling of sage. Dasan had leaped from the rocks. He tackled her, driving her into the depression of a dried creek bed, just as the air where she had been standing was shredded by lead. He covered her with his body, a human shield against the storm. Stay down, he roared. Then his body jerked. Once, twice. A grunt of air was forced from his lungs, wet and heavy. The firing stopped as the Apache warriors on the ridge unleashed a devastating volley of covering fire, forcing the Gatling gunner to retreat behind his shield. Nell scrambled out from under Dasan. Dasan! He rolled onto his back. The red paint on his chest was being washed away by a brighter, fresher red. A dark stain was spreading rapidly across his right shoulder, just below the collarbone. Another wound was bleeding sluggishly at his side. No, Nell gasped. Her hands hovered over the wounds, useless and shaking. No, no, no! Dasan looked up at her. His eyes were losing focus, glazed with shock. He reached up with his good hand, his bloody fingers touching her cheek. You! He wheezed, blood bubbling at the corner of his lips. You! Loud! Woman! Be quiet! Nell sobbed, pressing her hands against the wound in his shoulder, trying to staunch the flow. Do not speak, please. Did the children... They are safe, Nell cried. You saved them. We saved them. On the ridge, the tide was turning. The surprise of the flanking column had failed thanks to Nell's warning. The Apache warriors, fighting with the fury of men defending their families, were pushing the soldiers back. Hargrove, seeing his advantage lost and his hostage complicating the narrative, signaled the retreat. Pull back, the bugle sounded. Regroup at the pass. The shooting faded to sporadic pot shots. The smoke drifted lazily over the valley. Nell did not watch the soldiers leave. She did not care about Hargrove or the railroad or the war. She knelt in the bloody dust, cradling the head of the Apache chief in her lap. He was heavy, his breathing shallow and rattling. Help, she screamed, her voice tearing at her throat. Someone help him. Tahoe appeared at the edge of the creek bed. He looked down at his chief, bleeding in the arms of the white woman. He looked at Nell, her dress soaked in Dasan's blood, her face a mask of agony. He did not sneer. He dropped his rifle and jumped down, shouting for the medicine man. The battle was over. But as Nell looked at the gray pallor spreading across Dasan's face, she knew the real fight, the fight to keep the root of this love from withering in the grave, had just begun. The silence that followed the retreat of the cavalry was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, and smelling of copper. The valley, once a sanctuary of pine and rushing water, was now a field of broken earth and broken bodies. Eleanor Carver knelt beside the buffalo robes inside the medicine lodge, her hands stained with dried blood that was not her own. She had torn the hem of her petticoat into strips hours ago. using the precious cotton to bind the jagged hole in Dasan's shoulder and the graze along his ribs. He lay still, his chest rising and falling with shallow, ragged breaths. The fever had taken hold quickly, burning through him like a brush fire. His skin, usually the color of polished mahogany, was now ashen, beads of sweat standing out on his forehead. "Water," Nahiani whispered from across the small fire. Nell took the gourd. She dipped a scrap of cloth into the cool liquid and pressed it to Dasan's parched lips. "Drink," she murmured, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "Please, drink." He did not wake, but his throat worked reflexively, swallowing the drops. For 3 days and 3 nights. This was Nell's world. The sun rose and set outside the lodge, marking the passage of time she no longer understood. She did not sleep. She sat vigil, wiping his brow, listening to the rattle in his lungs, and praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening or if he was, whether he would answer the prayers of a woman who loved a heathen. The camp outside was in mourning. 7 warriors had died. The wailing of the widows echoed off the canyon walls at dusk, a sound that chilled Nell to the bone, but amidst the grief, something had shifted. On the second morning, Kiona entered the lodge. The boy looked older now, his face streaked with soot from the battle. He carried a bowl of broth. He knelt beside Nell. He did not look at Dasan. He looked at her. "Tahoe speaks," Kiona said in halting English. "He tells the men, you rode into the fire." Nell looked up, her eyes rimmed with red. "I rode to warn him." "Yes," Kiona nodded. "And before, in the canyon, you shot the soldier, to save me." He placed the bowl in her hands. "The women say you are Sika, friend, not captive." Nell looked down at the broth. Tears, hot and unbidden, pricked her eyes. "I am just a woman trying to keep him alive. Kiona." "He lives because you hold him here," the boy said simply, then rose and left. Later that afternoon, Nayani sat beside Nell. The hostility that had once defined the older woman's face was gone, eroded by the sight of Nell's tireless care. She reached out and took the bloody rags from Nell's hands. "Rest," Nahiani commanded in Apache, pointing to a pile of furs. "I cannot," Nell rasped. "If the fever spikes, if you die, who calls him back?" Nahiani asked, her dark eyes searching Nell's face. Then she switched to broken English, her voice grave. "You stay. You choose." "I chose," Nell whispered. "No," Nahiani shook her head. "You choose for now. But if he lives, you choose for life. To be an Apache wife is not soft. It is hunger. It is running. It is watching your children learn to kill or be killed." She gestured to the open flap of the lodge, to the rugged mountains beyond. "The blue coats will come back. They always come back. If you stay, you marry the war." Nell looked at Dasan's face, etched with pain even in sleep. She thought of the ranch, of the smell of coffee in her father's kitchen, of the dream of raising horses in peace. That life was a fading photograph. This life, the smell of sage, the constant danger, the fierce, consuming love of this man was real. "I am not afraid of the war," Nell said softly. "I am afraid of a life without him." Nahiani studied her for a long moment, then nodded. It was a seal of approval, a welcome into the sisterhood of sorrow and strength, needing air. Nell stepped out of the lodge at twilight. She walked to the creek, washing the grime from her face and arms. The water was ice cold, shocking her senses back to alertness. She sat on a flat rock, looking at her reflection. She looked different, thinner, harder. The sun had darkened her skin, and her hair, once pinned up in the fashion of a lady, hung loose and wild down her back. Would Pa recognize me, she wondered. The memory of Thomas Carver hit her with the force of a physical blow. She remembered his laugh, the way he would hum while mending fences. She remembered Jacob, his ambition, his pride. "They think I am dead," she whispered to the rushing water. If she went back now, could she explain? Could she tell Jacob that the savages were people? Could she tell the town that she loved the man they called a monster? No. They would hang her for treason, or lock her in an asylum for madness. She was Eleanor Carver, but that name felt like a costume she had outgrown. A rustle in the bushes made her jump. She reached for the knife Dasan had given her, a reflex she hadn't possessed a month ago. "Peace, Miss Carver," a voice whispered. Nell spun around. Crouched in the willows was a man she recognized. It was Silas, a trader who sometimes moved between the town and the tribes, a man who walked the gray line between worlds. "Silas," Nell hissed. "What are you doing here?" "Trading powder for pelts," the man said, keeping his voice low. "Though after the shooting, business is scarce." He looked at her, his eyes widening. "Lord above, Nell, it is true. You are alive." "Go back," Nell said, stepping back. "If the warriors see you." "I'm leaving," Silas promised, raising his hands. "But you should know. The town held a funeral for you." Nell froze. "What?" "Hargrove told them the Apache killed you in the canyon. Said he saw it himself. Used it to get the governor to sign off on more troops. 500 men coming from Fort Huachuca next month. He lied." Nell breathed. "He tried to kill me." "I figured," Silas spat. "But your brother, Jacob, is he alive?" Nell took a step forward, her heart clenching. "He is," Silas nodded. "But he is a ghost. Blames himself. He sits on the porch of your old place, staring at the mountains. He thinks you are gone. Nell, he thinks you are an angel now." Nell felt a tear track through the dust on her cheek. Jacob was grieving. He was suffering. "If I go back," she started. "If you go back," Silas interrupted. "Hargrove hangs you, or he kills you quiet-like to keep his story straight. You are a martyr now. Nell, martyrs are only useful when they are dead." The trader adjusted his pack. "You are dead to that world. Girl, best stay that way." He slipped back into the shadows, leaving Nell alone with the terrible gift of freedom. She was dead. The ties that bound her to Dusty Creek, the expectations, the debts, the family duty had been severed by a lie. She walked back to the medicine lodge. She entered the warm darkness and knelt beside Dasan. His eyes were open. They were glassy and fever-bright, but they were focused on her. "Dasan," she whispered, touching his cheek. He turned his head slightly, wincing. "You are here." "I'm here," she said. "I dreamed." His voice was a husk of its former power. "I dreamed you rode a pony into the fire. You shouted to the wind." "It was not a dream." Nell smiled through her tears. "It was very foolish, and very loud." Dasan tried to smile, but a cough racked his body. When it passed, he looked at her with a clarity that pierced her soul. "Why?" he asked. "You could have ridden south." "To the soldiers! To your home!" "I was home," Nell said. The words tumbled out, unplanned but absolute. Dasan stared at her. He saw the truth in her face. He saw the choice she had made. He reached out his hand, weak and trembling. Nell took it, pressing his palm against her cheek. "My land is dying. Eleanor," he rasped. "The iron road eats the mountains. The blue coats are like locusts." "We have no tomorrow, only today." "Then we will have today," Nell vowed fiercely. "And tomorrow we will fight for the next day." "You give up everything," he said, his thumb brushing a tear from her skin. "Your name, your blood." "My blood is your blood," Nell said. "You claimed me. Remember under the stars." Dasan closed his eyes, a look of profound peace settling over his features. "Yes, I claimed you. And you claimed me." He drifted back into sleep. But it was a natural sleep now, the fever breaking, the heat receding from his skin. The next morning, the camp was a hive of activity. The scouts reported that the main army column had retreated to the railhead, but they would return with reinforcements. The valley was no longer safe. The Council of Elders met at dawn. When they emerged, the decision was final. "We move," Goya announced, "deep into the Sierra Madre, where the horses cannot pull the guns. where the white man fears to tread. It meant leaving the fertile valley. It meant a hard winter in the high peaks of Mexico. It meant hunger and cold. Nell stood outside the lodge, watching the women pack the travois. Nayani approached her. "We go high," Nayani said. "Very far." Nell nodded. She went back inside. Dasan was sitting up, propped against a saddle. He was weak, but the fire was back in his eyes. "We leave at midday," he said. "I know," Nell replied. She began gathering his weapons, his medicine bag. "Eleanor," he said. She stopped. "The traitor," Dasan said. "I heard him last night. I was awake." Nell froze. "You heard?" "I heard that you are dead to them," Dasan said. "But you are not dead. You can go. You can find another town, another name. You do not have to climb the mountain with us." He was giving her an out. One last chance to save herself from the hard life of a fugitive. Nell picked up his Winchester rifle. She checked the lever action, wiped a speck of dust from the barrel, and walked over to him. She placed the rifle in his good hand. "I am Eleanor Carver," she said, her voice steady. "But Eleanor Carver died in the canyon. The woman standing here is named Izzy Nathan." She looked him in the eye. "And she is going where her husband goes." Dasan looked at the rifle, then up at her. He gripped the weapon, using it to pull himself to his feet. He swayed, and Nell instantly stepped in, wrapping her arm around his waist to support him. He leaned on her, heavy and warm. "Then let us climb," he said. They walked out of the lodge together, into the blinding sunlight. The tribe stopped their work to watch. They saw their chief, wounded but standing, and they saw the white woman supporting him, her shoulder under his arm, her face set toward the south, toward the mountains, toward the unknown. There were no cheers, just a silent, collective acknowledgement. She was no longer a captive. She was one of the people. As the column began to move out, winding its way up the treacherous trail toward the skyline, Nell did not look back at the valley, nor at the distant smoke of the railroad. She kept her eyes on the back of the hawk circling above, and on the path she was carving with every step beside the man she loved. The night before the tribe was to vanish into the Sierra Madre, the valley held its breath. The fires had been extinguished early, burying their light under mounds of ash to hide their position from any scouts who might still be prowling the lower ridges. The silence was absolute, save for the wind soughing through the needles of the ponderosa pines and the occasional stamp of a pony's hoof against the earth. Eleanor Carver stood alone on the limestone overlook. It was the same precipice where she had once stood weeks ago, shivering in terror and outrage, demanding answers from a captor. Now, she stood there wrapped in a trade blanket that smelled of wood smoke and sage, looking up at the same indifferent canopy of stars. She had thought, back in Dusty Creek, that freedom was a matter of miles. She had believed that if she could just save $600, she could buy a train ticket to California, buy a plot of land near the ocean, and finally be free of the dust and the expectations of men. She had thought freedom was the absence of fences. She looked down at her hands, calloused and stained with the walnut dye used for curing hides. She realized now that she had been wrong. Freedom was not about running away. Freedom was the terrible, beautiful power to choose who stood beside you when the storm broke. She heard the soft scrape of leather on the stone behind her. She did not flinch, nor did she reach for the knife at her belt. She knew the rhythm of those footsteps as well as she knew the beating of her own heart. Dasan stepped out of the shadows. He moved stiffly, favoring his right side where the bullet had torn through muscle and grazed bone. His chest was bound tight with strips of cotton, her petticoats and the dark bruise on his jaw from the rifle butt had faded to a sickly yellow. But he was standing. He was alive. He stopped 5 feet away from her. He did not cross the distance immediately. He leaned against a gnarled juniper tree, his dark eyes studying her profile against the starlight. "The wind is cold tonight," he said. His voice was raspy, the smoke of the battle still lingering in his throat. "It will be colder in the high mountains," Nell replied, turning to face him. "Nayani says the snow comes early to the Sierra Madre." "Yes," Dasan nodded. It is a hard country. The rocks are sharp. The belly is often empty. He took a step closer, the moonlight catching the silver concho on his belt. It is no place for a rancher's daughter who dreams of soft grass and fat horses. Nell stiffened slightly. I am not dreaming of soft grass. Dasan. Perhaps you should, he said gently. He closed the distance between them, stopping just inches away. He did not touch her, but the heat radiating from his body was a physical weight. He looked toward the north, toward the invisible line of the railroad tracks and the town of Dusty Creek. The scouts say the soldiers have pulled back to the fort, Dasan said quietly. The pass is open tonight, just for tonight. Nell looked at him, confusion furrowing her brow. What are you saying? I am saying that I have a fast horse saddled by the lower creek, Dasan said. His expression was mask-like, the stoic chief once again. But Nell saw the tension in his jaw, the way a muscle jumped near his temple. If we leave now, I can take you to the edge of the town before the sun rises. You can walk in. You can tell them you escaped in the confusion. He looked down at his hands, hands that had killed men to protect her, hands that had built fires to warm her. You have a father to mourn. Eleanor, you have a brother who thinks you are a ghost. Do you not owe them a goodbye? Nell felt the air leave her lungs. He was offering her a way out. This was the final test. In the canyon, he had claimed her like a prize. In the camp, he had kept her like a prisoner. But now, after she had ridden into the fire for him, after she had saved his people, he was giving her the only thing he had left to give. He was giving her the choice he had stolen from her weeks ago. He was willing to break his own heart to give her back her life. Nell looked toward the north. She thought of Dusty Creek. She thought of the boardwalks, the smell of sawdust in the saloon, the Sunday church bells. She thought of Jacob, sitting alone on the porch, staring at the empty horizon. If she went back, she would be safe. She would be the survivor. But she knew exactly what that life would be. Captain Hargrove would parade her through the territory as the tragic victim of savage brutality. He would force her to testify, twisting her words to justify his war. She would be a symbol, a tool, a hollow porcelain doll placed on a shelf to be pitied. She would be Eleanor Carver, the girl who survived. But she would never again be the woman who stood on a ridge and commanded the thunder. She turned back to Dasan. She reached out and took his hand. His skin was rough, warm, and alive. My father is dead. Dasan, she said softly, I mourned him in your lodge while I washed the blood from your chest. And Jacob chose his side when he rode with the man who fired the cannon. She squeezed his hand, her eyes locking onto his. If I go back there, I will die. Maybe not my body, but everything inside that matters. I become a ghost in a corset. Dasan watched her, his breath held tight in his chest. The path we walk, it leads to blood. Eleanor, it leads to hunting. It leads to the end of things. Then we walk it, Nell said, her voice fierce and steady. I told you in the lodge, I did not choose you for the summer. I did not choose you for the easy days. She stepped closer, placing her other hand on his wounded chest, directly over his beating heart. In that town, I am a possession. I am a daughter, a sister, a victim. Here, with you, who am I? Dasan covered her hand with his own. The mask crumbled completely, revealing a naked, overwhelming adoration that made her knees weak. Here, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. You are the air in my lungs. You are the reason the sun rises. He looked up at the stars, then back at her. Nayani has a name for you. She calls you Nantan Lupan. What does it mean? Nell asked. It means Grey Wolf. Dasan smiled, a faint, weary smile. But in the old songs, it means the one who walks between the worlds, the one who carries the spirit of the two lands. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. If you stay, you are no longer white woman. You are Nantan Lupan. You are the heart of the tribe. Then I stay, Nell whispered. I stay until the mountains crumble. There was no priest to bless them. There was no choir to sing hymns. There was only the vast, indifferent cathedral of the Arizona night, and the millions of stars that had watched over lovers and warriors for 1,000 years. Dasan pulled her into his arms, careful of his wound but unable to resist the need to hold her. They stood there on the edge of the world, two outcasts who had found a kingdom in each other's eyes. They made no grand speeches about winning the war, for they were both too pragmatic for lies. They promised only to live. They promised that as long as they had breath, they would not let the darkness win. "Tomorrow," Dasan whispered into her hair. "We ride." "Tomorrow," Nell answered, resting her head against his shoulder. "We ride." The sun rose over the Dragoon Mountains with a brilliance that seemed to mock the weary travelers. The evacuation began at first light. It was a procession of silence and dust. The women walked alongside the travois. The dogs trotted in the shadows of the horses, and the warriors rode on the flanks, their eyes scanning the horizon for the glint of brass buttons. Nell rode a sturdy pinto mare near the center of the column. She wore a buckskin tunic that Nahiani had given her, but around her neck, tucked beneath the leather, she wore a simple gold ring on a chain, her mother's wedding band, and in her saddlebag was a delicate lace handkerchief, stained with the red dust of the canyon. She did not leave these things behind. She carried them not as burdens, but as anchors. She was not erasing Eleanor Carver. She was forging her into something new, something stronger, like iron turned to steel in the forge. As the morning wore on, the tension in the column eased slightly. They were moving deep into the high country, away from the telegraph lines and the railroads. A group of children, Kiona among them, walked beside Nell's horse. They looked at her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. To them, she was the woman who had ridden into the cannon fire, one of the younger boys, struggling with a pony that refused to take the bit, looked up at her helplessly. Nell stopped her mare. She slid down, her boots hitting the rocky trail. "Easy now," she said in English, then switched to the Apache word she had learned. "D." She showed the boy how to press his thumb against the pony's jaw, how to speak low and calm, the way her father had taught her in the corral at Dusty Creek. "You do not fight the horse," she explained, guiding the boy's hands. "You ask the horse, like this." The pony accepted the bit. The boy's eyes went wide. "Shush," the boy said, pointing to the brush the pony was chewing. "Brush, brush," Nell repeated, testing the word on her tongue. She walked with them for the next mile, trading words for skills. She taught them how to braid a mane so it would not tangle in the brush. They taught her the names of the hawks circling overhead. It was a small thing, this exchange of language and habit, but it was the seed of a future that Hargrove and his soldiers could not destroy. It was the proof that hatred was learned, but respect could be earned. Far to the north, the town of Dusty Creek was waking up to a different reality. Jacob Carver sat on the porch of the homestead. The house was empty now, the silence echoing in the hallway where his father's boots used to tread. Jacob looked older than his 24 years. A jagged scar ran down his left cheek, a souvenir from the retreat at the canyon. But the deeper wound was in his eyes. He watched the dust settle on the road. The news came yesterday. Captain Hargrove had been relieved of his command, transferred back east after the disastrous tactical failure and the loss of the cannon position. The army was launching an inquiry. The glory Jacob had sought had turned to ash in his mouth. A rider approached the fence. It was Silas, the trader. Silas did not dismount. He simply rode close to the porch, reached into his saddlebag, and tossed a small object onto the weathered floorboards. "Found this near the upper creek," Silas said, his voice neutral. "Thought you might want it." He turned his horse and rode away without looking back. Jacob stared at the object. It was a piece of folded parchment, wrapped in a scrap of blue calico cloth. His hands shook as he picked it up. He unfolded the paper. It was not a letter. It was a page torn from a small Bible, Nell's pocket Bible. It was the page of Psalm 121. "I will lift up my eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help." In the margin, written in charcoal in a script he knew as well as his own, were 3 words. "I am home." Jacob stared at the words until they blurred. He looked up at the mountains, purple and majestic in the distance. He had spent the last month hating them, hating the people who lived in their shadows. He had wanted to burn the world down to avenge his sister, but she was not dead. I am home. She had not been taken. She had chosen. A wave of confusion washed over him, followed by a tidal wave of relief that nearly buckled his knees. She was alive? She was out there, somewhere in that vast, wild cathedral of stone. He crushed the paper in his hand, holding it against his chest. He did not feel anger. He realized, with a start, that he felt a strange envy. She had found something he had never known, a conviction strong enough to walk away from everything. "Goodbye, Nell," he whispered to the wind. He stood up, walked into the house, and placed the paper on the mantelpiece next to his father's picture. Then he took off his scout jacket, folded it neatly, and laid it on the chair. He would not be riding with the army again. Weeks later, on a high plateau in the Sierra Madre, where the air was thin and crisp as broken glass, the tribe stopped to make camp. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in violently beautiful streaks of violet, gold, and blood red. The world below was a sea of shadows, but up here, in the eagle's domain, the light held on. Nell stood on the edge of the plateau. She wore soft deerskin moccasins now, and her hair was braided with strips of red cloth. She looked out over the endless waves of mountains stretching south into Mexico. Dasan came to stand beside her. The wound in his shoulder was healing, leaving a scar that would match the others, a map of his survival. He did not speak. He simply reached out and took her hand. They stood there, silhouetted against the dying light. Two figures, small against the vastness of the creation, yet immense in their defiance. They knew the winter would be hard. They knew the soldiers would come again in the spring. They knew that the world was changing, that the iron rails were closing in, squeezing the wild places until they vanished. But as the first star appeared, the evening star, bright and unwavering, Nell felt a profound, unshakable peace. The war would continue. The injustice remained. But in this savage, beautiful land, love had not just survived. It had conquered the hate in her own heart. "Look," Dasan said, pointing to the star. "I see it," Nell answered. He squeezed her hand. "As long as it shines, Nantan Lupan, we are free." Nell smiled, squeezing back. "Then we are free forever." They turned away from the edge, walking back toward the fires that were beginning to flicker in the twilight, walking together into the heart of the wild. Unwritten future. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I poured 100 years of frontier dust and starlight into writing this for you, and I truly hope Nell and Dasan's journey touched your heart. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you in a bustling city, dreaming of the open plains, or perhaps somewhere quiet where you can see the stars yourself? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on the ending. Did Nell make the right choice? If you enjoyed this ride through the Wild West, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Hit that like button to let me know you want more stories like this. And if you really want to support the channel, smash that hype button so this story can reach more listeners across the world. Until we meet again on the trail ride safely.